To take a step back to talk about the scale of commercial real estate as an asset class in the US, the total estimated market value of commercial real estate in the US across different categories is about $20 trillion, with about $3 trillion being in the office market. In the US, we're seeing people not coming back to work and all these offices are empty. And we've talked a lot about these offices being written down. So how significant of a problem is this? So $20 trillion asset class, obviously the multifamily market is probably not as bad as office and retail, which are the most heavily affected, each of which are about $3 trillion a piece. The rest of these categories seem relatively unscathed in comparison. Industrial, hospitality, healthcare, those real estate sectors are probably pretty strong. Data centers obviously growing like crazy. Self-storage is a great market. So it turns out that of the $20 trillion of market value, there's about $6 trillion of debt. So you can kind of think about that 20 trillion being 6 trillion owned by the debt holders and 14 trillion by the equity holders. And the debt is owned roughly 50% by banks and thrifts. And this was this concern that we've been talking about with higher rates. Is the debt on office actually going to be able to pay? The debt on retail going to be able to pay? When half of that debt is held by banks and thrifts that, as we've talked about, have such a close ratio to deposits that you could actually see many banks become technically insolvent if the debt starts to default. You look at the office market, which, is marked on everyone's books as $3 trillion of market value. He thinks it's probably worth closer to 1.8 trillion. So there's $1.2 trillion of loss in the office category. And if you assume 40% of that 3 trillion is held as debt, you're talking about $1.2 trillion of office debt. A reduction from 3 trillion to 1.8 trillion means that the equity value has gone down from 1.8 trillion to 600 billion. So they've lost. Equity holders in office real estate have probably lost 2/3 of their value, 2/3 of their investment. And who owns all of that? Most of that, 60+%, call it 2/3 of that, is likely owned by private equity funds and other institutions where the end beneficiary is actually pension funds and retirement funds. And so if 2/3 of the value has to be written off in these books and it hasn't happened yet, what's going to happen to all these retirement funds? And this is where going back to my speculation a couple months ago kind of gets revisited. If you're actually talking about a 2/3 write-down on the value in these funds, most of that being pension funds, you're not going to see governments let that happen. You're going to see the federal government. Right? Yeah. There's going to be some action at some point, and it's unlikely the office market is going to suddenly rebound overnight. If this stays the way it is, who's going to fill that hole for retirees and pensioners? Because we're not going to let that all get written down. Someone is going to step in and say, we've got to do something about this. And there's going to need to be some sort of structured solution to support retirees and pensioners, because that's ultimately who ends up holding the bag in this massive write-down. He didn't go all the way there in his statements. He was talking more about his estimate of 3 trillion to 1.8 trillion. And then I tried to connect the dots and what that actually means. And ultimately, there's going to be some pain felt by retirement funds that's going to need to be dealt with somehow. So, Sachs, I don't know if that sits right with you.
I mean, I think the big picture is right. I think you're applying a lot of averages.
Right.
I think in the office market in particular, the typical office deal is more like 1/3 equity and 2/3 debt. There's just a lot more leverage.
Right.
So that'd be point number one, which makes the situation worse.
Even worse, yeah.
So I would say that there's a huge amount of equity that's been written off. But in addition to that, there's a lot of debt holders who are in trouble too. Yeah. And that debt is held by regional banks. So these commercial loan portfolios are significantly impaired. That's what we saw with Community Bank of New York, is that their stock cratered when they reported higher than expected losses in their commercial real estate portfolio. So Friedberg, I think the point is just the pain from this is not just going to be on the equity holders, but also on these banks, which can't afford to lose very much.
It's not evenly distributed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And we saw this in San Francisco, where some of these buildings have 70% debt to equity ratios, and the value puts them in the hole, and the equity's wiped out completely, and the debt holders have to take a hit. And normally, that debt is not really written off very often.
Well, this is why the debt holders don't want to foreclose. They don't want to get these buildings back, because when they do, they're going to have to write down the loan. As long as the loan is still outstanding and they haven't foreclosed, they can pretend that the value of the building is not impaired.
Kick the can down the road is the best strategy for them.
So it's called pretend and extend. So what they'll do is they'll work out a deal with the landlord, the equity holder, that the equity holder will say, listen, I can't pay the interest. So they'll just tack on the interest basically as principal at the end of the loan, and they'll extend out the term of the loan.
Which would wipe out the equity at a certain point, yeah.
Well, no, what it does is it allows the equity holder to stay in control, own the building, right? Because, the equity holder can't make their debt payments today, but they're going to postpone those debt payments till the end of the loan. And again, in the meantime, just kind of hope that the market recovers.
Couldn't that debt at some point, since they have so little equity in these buildings, typically just exceed the value of the property? And it's like, I'm just working for the bank now, and why am I even putting this work in?
Because everyone kind of hopes that the market will recover, the value of their equity will go up, and they'll be able to make their debt payments again.
Yeah.
So if you're the equity holder, you'd rather hold on and have a chance of your equity being worth something in recovery than definitely lose the building. And if you're a regional bank, you'd rather blend and extend or pretend and extend, as opposed to having to realize the loss right now.
Yep.
And showing the market that your solvency may not be as good as you thought. The same thing happened with government bonds. Remember that with SVB and these other banks, they had these huge held to maturity bond portfolios.
Yep.
These are mostly just T-bills that were worth, 60 cents on the dollar when interest rates spiked from 0 to 5%. But they didn't have to recognize that loss as long as they weren't planning to sell them.
Right. And then when they had the bank run, they had to sell.
Well, that's right. So when depositors left because they needed their money, or because there was a run, or because they could get higher rates in a money market fund, all of a sudden these banks had to sell their held to maturity portfolios. They had to recognize that loss. And that's when everyone realized, oh, wait a second, they're not actually solvent.
Okay. So Chamath, supply demand matters in real estate. We have a tale of two cities here. On one side, in real estate, for commercial real estate, no demand for office space, which is in way too much supply. Paradoxically, on the other side, we have this incredible market for developers, which is, there's not enough homes. I think we need 7 million more homes, and the demand is off the charts for homes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're basically right.
It's not, I keep trying to explain, residential is not a great market either because interest rates have spiked up. So there's not a vacancy problem. Multifamily developers are still able to lease the units. They're still able to rent. The problem is their financing costs have shot through the roof. So again, let's say you were a developer who built multifamily in the last few years. You took out a construction loan. That construction loan might have been at 3-4%.
Yeah.
Now you want to put long-term financing on it. But if you can even find debt right now, because there's a credit crunch going on, you might have to pay 8, 9, 10%.
Yeah, but at least you can find a renter.
You can find a renter, that's true, but only at a certain price. And let's say you underwrote that property to, like a 5 cap, like a certain yield.
Yeah.
But now your financing costs are much higher than you thought. You might be underwater.
Yeah.
Meaning
but that situation isn't as bad as what's happening in.
Why? I think it's worse in some ways.
Worse.
If you're fully rented and your building is underwater because now your debt payments are much higher than you expected, then there's no business model.
Yeah, but are we seeing that? Are we seeing tons of multifamily go under?
Yeah. Can I make 2 points? One, I think David is right, which is that I don't know this market very well, but just as a bystander, here's what I observe. It seems that the residential market has a feature, and I don't know whether it's good or bad, but that feature is that you reprice to market demand every year. So to the extent that supply demand is changing and default rates are up or whatever, that's reflected in rents. And you see that because rents change very quickly, and most human beings are signing 6-month to 1-year leases. So that reset happens very quickly, so it can more dynamically adapt. So to the extent that a market segment is impaired, you see the impairment quickly. On the office side, what I see is that there's been a structural behavior change in COVID that has reset in every other part of the world except for the United States, where there are these, frankly, typically younger, typically more junior employees that have held many of these companies hostage in a bid to return back to office space. And so we know that there is this vacancy cliff that's going to hit commercial real estate. We just don't know when, because they're in long-term leases. They're canceling these leases over long periods of time. So the reset cycle is longer. That's just my observation as an outsider. I don't know what that means for prices or anything else, but it just seems that at least the residential market can find a bottoming sooner.